Welcome to Surviving Society.
Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Role of Love in Social Justice Work. I'm joined with Sammarah Hanin. I'm going to hand it over to you to introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Sammarah. Introductions are always a bit odd. I am an Afro Palestinian woman, half Palestinian, half Sudanese, a community organizer, movement builder, movement lover, and a creative. Yeah.
Thanks. And I met Sammarah. I was delivering some work with the organisation that Sammarah works for, and I was struck by the love in the space. Just generally, it felt really like a loving team. I really was drawn to the cause in terms of what it is that you guys work on. But then, and that was why I was like, okay, great, this will be a great piece of work to deliver on. I was kind of delivering a team day and also delivered the day with their trustees. And so, yeah, I was struck by the love in the space and was struck by how willing and open people were to engage with love in the workplace. And that was really, warming for me. And I felt really, every time you spoke, you brought challenge, and it almost challenged the space to be more loving. So we were speaking about that. It was a strategy day for your team planning, and we were speaking about kind of structures and processes and how we're moving things forward and how you're growing as an organisation. And each time you brought challenge, the undertone that I was receiving was, and how do we do this in a way that is more loving? How do we do this in a way that creates more space for people to exist as themselves? And I was really impressed by that, basically.
Thank you so much.
I really want to talk about it. Yeah.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. And yeah, I agree. I mean, it's taken me a long time to find an organisation that prioritises care and love in the way that Daro does. Daro Youth Project is an incredible space and very grassroots, very rooted in creating community and love and care at a time where there's such need for that. There are a lot of charities doing amazing work, but I think Daro is quite unique in that it really focuses on that community element and allows people to feel seen and safe and recognised and connected with. So yeah, I really love the work that we do.
Yeah, and I was like, are we naming Daro? Are we not naming, but we're naming it, so great. No, I'm good. And I think one of the things I love about the work, so it's an organisation set up to support young people from the Horn of Africa that are finding their way of existing in this space, in this country. And it's based in South London. And I think being of West African heritage, and just knowing there are some kind of like cultural pieces to my world. There are like the fabric of my world is made up of so much, and what care looks like for me is very different to what it will look like for somebody else. And I think that feels mirrored in the approach to the work. So it's like, actually, this is very contextual, but also broad enough to encompass young people from different backgrounds that speak different languages. So it's not like this is for one type of young person, but it does really consider the cultural context. And that feels mirrored in the staff team. And I'm not just talking about racially, but I mean more in terms of the approach, centres, practice that doesn't feel Western. It doesn't feel like a typical quote unquote westernized professional space. It feels like, actually, no, we consider the cultural context of this work, and that is how we prioritize how we do things.
Yeah, I think the space is also, it's grown a lot. I mean, I joined a few years into the organisation being founded, but it was founded by members of the community, by people with lived experience of migration, by people who really cared to create a space that understood that whilst we need to create collective care and we need to cultivate a space where we can allow young people to thrive, young people are also individuals and their experiences are individual. And a lot of the time in general with migrant refugee work or work with minority groups or marginalized people do tend to get boxed in. And I think when you have an organization founded by people who understand the culture, the language, the tradition, even down to things like, the food we provide, there's something really caring and loving about that, but without kind of limiting people into this kind of box that a lot of refugees, just by virtue of the way they have to exist in this system, are kind of put into. And I think that's why it's so special, and it's grown to bring in people with different lived experiences. Not, as you've said, not everyone on the team is the same. Not all of our young people are from the same backgrounds. We've all got very, very different experiences. But what I would say is so special is that there is space to bring in a new lens of lovingness, of care, of challenging oppression, of challenging each other in a very caring way, and being really honest about the limitations that exist by virtue of working within such a compound, structurally unfair system. Being able to create that honesty with the young people as well, and kind of give an understanding of what some of the challenges they'll face are and how we can be there to support them. And as a team, we very much also build that into the work that we do every day, and we communicate in a very caring way. And yeah, it's just a really beautiful place to work, and I'm very, very proud to be there. And I'm really glad it exists, because for many, many reasons, these spaces just don't really exist anymore. The funding isn't there, the resources aren't there, and it's really challenging to build. And credit to our director, she's amazing. I won't name her, but she's incredible, and she's done so much work to build out the organisation in a way that allows that love to continue to grow and allows it to be a really beautiful space for young people. So yeah.
Thanks for bringing in the stuff about leadership, because I think there's something about that, and so there's something about your director. I'm wowed by her. I think she's brilliant, and I think that her commitment. So even in terms of like commissioning the piece of work that I was doing with you, there was like, it was a lot about that, and just make sure there's space for care, and that actually I train and do coaching around collective care, and often that's the thing that organisations are like, I'll have a bit of that, but that we've got a strategy that we need to follow, and that's the thing that's important. And it feels like I'm trying to slip it in through a back door, but actually that was the priority from your director. And there was something about her leadership, and there's something that I saw on the day of your leadership, and that mirroring that kind of centering of care in terms of how you are choosing to lead and be a leader within that organisation. And so, talk to me a little bit more about your role, and both within Daro, but also I know you do work across different social justice movements. So, talk to me about that.
Well, firstly, I really appreciate that. So thank you. I mean, leadership is always a difficult concept for me, because I feel like a lot of the time, and I've worked at a lot of organisations, I've volunteered in a lot of different spaces, I've been part of lots of different movements, and I've kind of been through that wave of hating hierarchy and being like, it shouldn't exist, and then also becoming a little bit more realistic as I've practiced more and understanding that there's always going to be hierarchy. It's really how it's managed that's really important. But also being a Black woman in the third sector and in social justice work, unfortunately, I've had the experience of often having my voice kind of either silenced, ignored, or being sidelined, basically. And I think coming into this organisation, into this era of my life, I guess, with the experience that I've had, I've been able to kind of get to a point where I know how to make sure my voice is heard and how I make sure other people's voices are heard. And so the leadership element of my work is challenging the kind of stereotypical things that come with hierarchy in terms of like directing people or telling people what to do. And again, mirroring what the director of the organisation does and people that I've met that really inspire me do, which is to allow people to bring their voice to the table and to be able to kind of create a space where people can bring either their very fresh eyes because they're new to the work or their very experienced kind of lens of working and their way of connecting with each other and with whoever we're working to support or whoever we're working to bring to the forefront. But I also, sometimes I wish I was more quiet and like, I sometimes wish that I could just like I mean, I am generally quite controlled, and there are things I won't say, but if I find that there's a point that I want to bring forward, I will. I mean, there's a running joke with my friends where it's like, Sammarah will always tell you the truth, and it's a good thing, and it's also not sometimes. But I also think that's what makes a lot of the spaces that I've worked in really special, is that you can, as long as you're kind of doing it with care, you can bring forward the difficulties that come naturally from doing this work. There's no way things are going to be always easy, fair, and idyllic in a sector that is super under-resourced, in a sector that is super, we're really going against the grain. We're going against what the system is trying to achieve. And we still have to rely on the system to a certain extent for like just basic logistics of running a space like that. In terms of my social justice work outside of my employment, I think one of the things that I'm finding is like, a lot of us are very tired now, I think, especially with the last year. This last year has been excruciatingly painful for many of us, especially people from Palestine and Sudan and Congo and all of the areas of the world that are seeing the horrific things that we're witnessing. And I think in terms of leadership and connection, it's really about also passing on the baton when you're tired and being able to share that responsibility and share that collective care and speak up when things get really exhausting and delegate and liaise on like what you can bring today that you might not be able to bring next Thursday, because, we're all also trying to survive. We also all need to eat, which is something that I think the system really relies on in terms of eventually people will get exhausted. And I think both at Daro and outside of Daro, where I've been involved in organising, where I've been involved in speaking up, where even in this space, it's really just being honest about what can we bring, how can we bring it, where can rest be created, where can space for anger be created, because like it's not easy work, and if we don't acknowledge our feelings of anger and frustration, that sits there and turns into stagnation or exhaustion or burnout. And so I really think, in terms of when we look at love and in social justice work, that's a really important element when in leadership positions or not. Really, it's allowing people to be themselves and to speak up when they're getting to the point where they feel like, I don't know how to do this today or this week or for the foreseeable, and having those conversations about how can we do this together rather than me telling you what to do, which is what I've experienced in the past in many spaces as well. Does that make sense?
It makes a lot of sense to me. There was so much in what you just said there. I really love that framing. What can you bring today? And when I think about my work, and when I think about not just my work, when I think about the body that I live in and social justice work and what it means to do this work living in this body, that question, what can you bring today, is that framing and the recognition that what I bring today isn't necessarily what I'll be able to bring tomorrow. And that is both internally and externally. Events inside me and outside of me will dictate the answer to that question. And there's something about, for me, the real need to work in spaces and relationships where that is not just acknowledged in words, but where there are practices that allow that question to be answered truly. What can one bring today? And I think there's also something about, from my end, what does responsibility and accountability look like? Because we live in a world, and I'm going to kind of hone it into, we work in a sector where there's so much to do all the time. So it's like, actually, how do I recognize my need for love and care and to work in a way that allows me to bring what I can today, whilst also holding myself accountable to the wider movement, the bigger picture that is bigger than what I can bring today. And being responsible enough to own, like, to kind of step in and out. It's kind of like an ebb and flow. I think I recognize, I used to be in a place where I'm like, I never want to reach burnout. Never. I'm like, I was working against burnout. It's working for cultures of rest and care. And that is important. It's not me I'm not trying to kind of diminish that in any way, but I'm now in a place where I'm like, oh no, to get this job done the way I want it done. So not like, it's not an external pressure out from the outside in, but internally, to do this job the way I want it done, sometimes I will reach burnout. And that sometimes I'll have to work in a way that means that I'm gonna be tired. Right. And then what are the structures around that I've created for myself that support me to rest through that? And how am I creating balance so that isn't the only way that I work? And so it's like, and that to me, there's a level of self-accountability and responsibility that comes with that, where it's like, I went through a phase of like putting full responsibility on the quote unquote movement. Even that term I struggle with because I don't think there is a movement.
No.
But I used to put full responsibility on external factors for how I operate within the work, and I'm kind of learning actually there is a self-love that I'm developing through spaces of collective love, and both things sharpen each other.
Yeah, I think also I remember like last October when everything had started in Palestine, there's a lot of conversation around westernized ideals around what self-love and self-care and rest look like, and those being quite problematic, and trying to challenge those ideals for myself in my work, in my home, in my person, and understanding that there's also a lot of rest that comes with creating communities where we don't live at the pace of what, racial capitalism has created for us all and said that we have to, the idea of like, of course, sometimes, yes, I want to do a face mask or go to a spa, and like those really obvious ways of sort of caring for myself will happen, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I also think it's just really important and really beautiful for us to bring back forward the ways that our communities have always cared for each other, and have, even in many unnamed ways that you can't categorize and put a label on and write, like a little cute guidebook around, in terms of how we pause when we slow down, because like you said, the work will never end. I could work 24 hours a day, and ultimately, the structures that be, unless they change integrally, which at the moment there's no sign of that happening, there'll still be more work because there's so much demand, and we're living in a world that's really uneven. So for me, it's really, and that's the kind of thing that's really special about the space that I work in, is there is that very kind of collectivist understanding of what it means to care for each other, of what it means to also trust each other. Like the director that we were speaking about earlier, one of the things I really admire is she's chosen people she has developed a very trusting relationship with, and she trusts them to carry out their work in a brilliant way. And that trust goes both ways. So whilst there might be moments of tension or moments of challenge, and that's what's really special about it, is that there is real trust there. Same goes for movements outside of kind of paid employment, where for me the biggest problem I've found is often there's not enough trust to talk about when people are at burnout, when people are existing in burnout. I also think we kind of conceptualize burnout as this like, there's a moment you hit a wall, and like I was doing my master's for 3 years in law, and I was working 2 jobs. I basically lived in burnout for like at least the last year. I was exhausted, and I was lucky enough to have people around me, whether in my personal life, my work life, my organizing life, that understood that created space for it without even, a lot of the time you don't even need to talk about it. It's this thing of like, you're tired, so let's think about how we can take some off your load, and then you can kind of create space for more when you have that. And that's a cyclical model. That's something that we do together. And, sometimes it's really just allowing people to have space to vent, to have space to question, to have space. And we see it also with, with the young people I work with a lot of the people in the Palestinian community who are currently living through some of the hardest times that I think our community has ever lived through, where it's really just giving time to speak about it or not speak about it, or just sit with each other. Being really honest about the fact that like, no, I'm not great today. I really am not great this week. I'm not great this year. And it's not a but, it's an and we keep kind of caring for each other and caring for ourselves as part of that process. And And sometimes it's also telling people, you know, I don't want to do this anymore. That's one of the things I find hardest when it comes to social justice work, because we all care and we're all really passionate, and like, you know, specifically Black women and like Black and brown queer people have been so socialized into also doing the work always. Don't say no. Just do it. Just crack on. There's more important things. You know, your problems are first world problems, which all of these things are actually often true. But, you know, I've also allowed myself over the years to go, why should I always be the one to pick up the work? Can I take a moment? Can I say no? And if I'm saying yes, why am I saying yes? And that is a work in progress. We're not there yet. And I feel like for a lot of us, because we do care, and there are people who are in much worse situations than, I'll speak for myself, than I am in. But also, if we don't say no to certain things, if we don't pause, and if we're not also very selective about the spaces where we go and speak up, and we go and say, you know, then that can also be really damaging. You know, for me, even coming into this space, I knew I'd be safe and comfortable and able to be really honest about some of the challenges that we face. There are spaces where in the past I have put myself in and really regretted, because there's not a desire to really understand a different way of living, of working, of loving. It's all very pragmatic and practical and tick boxy, and like this work is not pragmatic and practical and tick boxy. Of course, you got to get the to-do list done, and there's things that are very sort of practical that you need to do, but you really need to find that love and continue to pour from that place. When that runs out, and there's nothing wrong with the moment where you kind of go, this world is so messed up, I can't really do this work anymore, but I do think it's time to go, I'm going to pass this on to someone who has that capacity, and go and do something different where I can pour from that place. And I think that's where a lot of the problems that arise in this sector come from, is people are getting exhausted, and in many other spaces not having the time, energy, space, language, tools to be able to say, I'm exhausted and I need someone else to help me, or I need, you know.
Yeah, I love that you mentioned the difference between doing this work in the way that centres love and the kind of more tick boxy approach to social justice, which is one that I personally really, really struggle with. I find it really hard to sit with. I think there's something, when you were speaking, I was thinking about my position as a Black working class woman and the work that happens outside of the work. So like the work, I'm in the work of social justice, and that is like the day job. But then the familial connections, the kind of community connections, the way that like the work doesn't stop at the work. And actually the work doesn't start at the work and didn't start at the work. So I think there's something about, in recent years, I came to a realisation, I want to say 5 or 6 years ago, with something that, just echoing something that you've said earlier, where it's like, oh, the work's never going to get done. It's never going to get done.
No.
And I am not going to be the martyr to die for the work. So what is the balance? And that place, it was so liberating for me. It was just like letting go of this version of myself that really was working to an end. Like there was like a belief, a true belief, and a naive belief that if I work harder, if I do more, that will be the thing. And that isn't to say that we don't keep going. That isn't to say that, like, I still strongly believe that my work contributes in ways that are important. But I think there's like a self-importance that I've lost. It's just like, oh yeah, like, and I can do this and I can do other things. And like, if I'm not doing this existed before me and will exist long after I'm gone. And so that's like taking away that self-importance was humbling and helpful. But also I think before, when I was working towards the end, I was significantly more tolerant of tick boxy approach. Because I was like, oh well, it's part of the work, or oh well, like, it's a means to an end, or oh well, that relationship may benefit me in that way, or being perceived in a particular way in the sector was important to me, having a particular reputation, getting certain awards, all of that stuff, and like being in that world, and then getting to a place where like, oh no, this is all bullshit. this is all bullshit. That I don't, and actually I was on a path, and particularly I think from the path that I've taken in this sector has been very via lived experience. And that it's always been the thing that, oh yeah, lived experience, babe. Before lived experience was the buzzword. And so it's like the recognition of what it took/takes to exist in that way, in a sector that has been so deeply extractive, that has been so harmful, that hasn't asked me the question, what can you give today?
Yeah.
And then me feeding into that with my own kind of misconception of my own self-importance in the work. And that, yes, I think I've gone on a real journey. Of like unlearning a lot of that, challenging the place in me that I think there is, and I still have it, I still have this kind of, this thing in me that like I gain, like there is like and like having to, again, through therapy, through like different ways, having to look in the mirror and be like, what do you gain from being so busy? What do you gain from being the one that's always taking on the role, that's always helping the person? What is that giving you? There's something in that, beneath that. It isn't as noble as you might be pretending it is to yourself and to others. And so having to do that work, and then now I'm at a point where I'm like, oh yeah, no, I'm not doing the tick boxing, and it will cost me relationships, and it will cost me money, and it will cost me my reputation in some spaces and whatever it is. But it's like, oh yeah, no, I'm not willing to work in that way. And so I think that's another thing that I felt really drawn to by you, is that I could recognize more intuitively than anything else that you had similar lines in terms of how, because again, we were talking about it in the context that like we met in the context that did feel quite loving, that but you were still bringing challenge, and that challenge to me only brought us forward in a direction of like deeper loving practice.
Well, I'm really glad that's how it felt. I mean, it's still like, hearing you speak, it's still a battle. Like, I will often find myself on my phone writing lists of things to do whenever it's very difficult for me to relax and just take a moment and be like, I'm just going to lay here and watch television. I can't. And I think I have a friend who, when I was studying and working, we went for coffee and she said, Sammarah, you're working like an immigrant parent. And it really hit me, and it actually still sits with me today. Whenever I'm kind of overdoing it, I remember that. And I remember that actually it's so important to pause, and it's so important to move from a place of intuition and to kind of course, I mean, writing lists helps me personally as a very practical tool. But I think just taking a beat to think about what I'm taking on and why, and to take a little bit off my plate is super, super important. But I also learned from my mum and their generation. And my mum did a lot of incredible, incredible work. And over the last couple of years, I've been trying to sit down and interview her about it and understand where she came from, where her approach came from. And I think, I'll speak for my parents and my community. That generation worked really, really hard, but also in a very different context, where there were milestones you could achieve for yourself and for your community in a different way than in this kind of late stage capitalism era, where, for example, things like buying a house, and it's just not going to happen, is it really? Let's be honest. So, and I think we've kind of come full circle where community is really important. And I think we saw that a lot in the pandemic, for example, where we were all very isolated, but also people did start caring for each other in a way that wasn't about money, resources, or practicalities. It was really about sort of creating the things that create an alternative for the things money can buy. I always think of like the Black Panther movement, and I remember reading about how they were described by the head of, I think, the FBI at the time as the greatest threat to the internal security of the United States, right? And I think the reason for that wasn't there, we're picking up guns or doing this, that, and the other. I really think that the cause for the fear was that they created an alternative. They created a community that would feed one another, that would educate one another, that would replace all of the institutions that had kept people boxed in. And that is very dangerous when the powers that be start to see that you don't really need them anymore, that there are other ways for people to provide for themselves and one another and be able to exist, survive and thrive. you've got a really big problem because you can't make money off of us anymore. And that's really the crux of the issue. For me, the kind of community create and learning from the kind of intergenerational thing that brings me to the work that I'm doing now, it's very automatic. It's the work that I feel I was born to do. I feel like I do very intuitively, like you said, and I really enjoy. And also challenging that kind of intergenerational thing of working really, really, really hard to just survive, and taking, walking in my mum's footsteps and my grandparents' footsteps, and understanding that we will never be silent about oppression, and also challenging kind of putting yourself in a space where you're oppressing yourself for the resources that you need to survive, and going, okay, how do we create enough community that we can all actually be okay if we have a moment where we need to step away, if we have a moment where we're really unwell, if we have a moment where we're so angry we can't really function anymore, And in the space of work, my employment, and I'm so lucky, it took me years to get to an organisation where we can have those conversations, where, one of us can turn up or not turn up one day and say, I cannot do it today. And we can look after each other. For the young people, we allow them space to have their moments of ranting and just being angry, and we're super honest, And the food, I can't emphasize how much food is such a central element, I think, of collective care. How much creating space for people to come together and eat together and just sit down and be, like, strip away all of the super, consumerist, capitalist nonsense that we're always drawn towards because we have to be, and just have some food and sit down and be present with one another. I think that's a real challenge to the structures that we live in, and I think it's really important. And I really, and I think that is the crux of the love that is created in, like, very genuine social justice spaces, is creating space for people to be and to breathe and to sit with each other, to hold each other, and to say, if everything falls apart, you're still going to be able to be here because we have this community and we have this space. And that's something we learn from our ancestors who've done this work, whether in a formal or informal space for generations before. And that tick boxy thing that we all live in, you get on the tube, you tick the box, you tapped in, and now you're on the tube and you need to get off at a certain station, then you tap out. And everything we do in, like, late stage capitalism is very tick boxy. You have to do the stages of everything, even though it's all chaos. And I think that illusion has to be stripped away when we're doing the work. And I don't think you can go wrong if you move from a place of real care. Of course, again, I don't want to underemphasize that there are practical things that need to be done. But I think the most problematic spaces I've ever been in are spaces where all of the practical things are done, and everything looks shiny and tidy and cute and, like, prestigious and respectable, but you go into the work, you go into the space, and no one really actually cares what the outcome will be if you really kind of break it down. So and I think that's where the real kind of value of people coming together in this kind of realm is. Yeah.
And as you were speaking there, I was just thinking about, because I feel very similar. I think I've been in spaces that are very shiny, that are doing all the right things, that their KPIs are met and great. And actually, I don't feel that those are spaces that are very effective. And I think there's something about the theory of this work. There's the theory of social justice and how that plays out in practice. And I think my experience of people that have spent a lot of time thinking about this stuff that haven't been in practice is that the blind spots that they have, because there's an arrogance that comes with, I know I've studied, I've worked in these spaces that uphold a particular way of doing something. There isn't a curiosity, there isn't an openness, there isn't flexibility and fluidity around how we meet our aims. There isn't listening to what, if those aims need to change halfway through, because actually that isn't the thing anymore. That is affecting the people that we're here to serve. And I always think about this. So I work freelance, and one of the main reasons I've worked freelance, apart from all my personal issues, there is, like, a real, for me, I'm really intrigued by what it means to step into spaces, offer what I can, and step out. that the recognition that actually I contribute to a process, but I'm not necessarily like part of. I'm not part of the day-to-day function of that. And different clients or kind of organizations or individuals that I work with, that there's different degrees to which I have a relationship with those organizations. So for example, with Dara, I've now signed up to volunteer, which I'm excited about. So that work, again, being inspired by that space, that's a part of work that is a type of work that I want to be a part of and contribute more to where I can, and recognise that there may be things I can offer and there will be things that I will learn. And there's, I think, so shifting my approach to working relationally, which again, like, my bills need to be paid, I need to be paid, all of that stuff is important. It is important, but I think I'm guided significantly more at this stage. And I want to name this as a privilege. So I'm not, I recognise I've had to work to get here, and there is a lot. It's not an overnight thing, but I think being in a position where I'm able to be more intuitive and work with a more relational approach. And that to me is what allows me to remain in kind of quote unquote social justice work. Because doing it any other way, I personally have not worked for an organisation apart from Equitable Change, where I would say, and even then I don't work for them, I freelance for them, but I haven't worked for an organisation where I've felt that there is fluidity to be with love and care as and when it comes. And I recognise why, but I guess I'm trying to move away from that. For me personally, I really struggle. And I know different people have different roles within this stuff. And so I know people that work in spaces where actually it's really important that they work there, because them working there means that I'm able to do what I do, and others are able to do what they do, and they have the skill set and the capacity to work in those spaces, within those institutions. But yeah, so I guess I'm just noticing for me that I can't do social justice work without being able to be truly responsive to the moment.
I think that also, that thing you just said about people's roles as part of whatever it is that they do. There's a book by Angela Davis called Freedom is a Constant Struggle, where she names something that I think is often lost on us in social justice work, in these spaces, which is, humans have a tendency to be able to, if something really bad happens, we tend to look at the one person that was at the forefront of that really awful thing, go, it was all his fault, he was the evil man, and there are many examples in history, right? So Hitler was the evil man who did the Holocaust on his own. It's not, obviously that's not what is said, but I think emotionally that's the relationship that people have with that figure. The same goes for really amazing things, like Martin Luther King was he was great. And also there were hundreds of thousands of people or millions of people behind that person pushing a movement forward. And I think it's really about finding, again, challenging the very individualistic thing of pinpointing blame on one person and giving glory to one person, and actually looking at how as a movement, how as a space, do we all come together and bring all the things that we do best to create change, to create an alternative, because that's really what's missing at the moment, I think, is there's still not really an alternative way of kind of living that allows us to build with full force. And I think kind of, for me, that's a really important element of the work. You can't do it all alone. This is not on you. It's not on us. It's not. And this is where you inspire people to also step into the movement. I think a lot of people are on the outskirts because they're like, what can I do? I don't know. I didn't study this, or I didn't do this, or and I don't have the very practical skills kind of thing. But really, again, it's taking your skills and being responsive and being able to step into the space and offer what you can, and being able to kind of build the relationships and connections and be malleable. Because studying law as well, this was something that came to me when you were also just making your point, that flexibility, the law is very malleable. I always say it's a scam because there's not really any laws. The laws are what they are interpreted to be for the particular situation that a case is brought in or a situation is brought in. And I actually did law because I was like, okay, I need a decent backfall. I need to, like, if I, end up in a really difficult situation, I need a career that will allow me to do everything that I need to do. And then I ended up finding it really, really interesting because the law is really about psychology. It's bent into different shapes, usually in the interest of profit in this country, right? And I think what we need to do is learn how to reverse that process in the interest of all people who are trying to struggle for a different way of living, for a liberated way of being, for a recognition of all of the harm that has been done, and a reparative framework that allows us to move forward as a society that really cares for each other and that is just, living sustainably on its land. And I think that malleability is often missing in the third sector, in social justice work. It's so target driven a lot of the time. And like you said, you have all these organizations that meet their KPIs and have their funding and blah, 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 and are achieving things. I don't want to also say that, it's black and white and those people aren't doing really important work, because that's not fair. But I think that long term, they become a kind of redeeming element of society. Like the government can say, look, we have civil society doing all this great work, which proves we're not a dictatorship. And, everything's great here. People can speak out, but really people can't speak out past a certain point. And there's very, very rigid rules as to what your role is as an organizer in civil society. And I think the radical element of the work, and, that's a dirty word a lot of the time, but really the radical shift happens when you create space for intuitive thinking, when you create space for responsiveness that isn't rooted in who's funding us and what's doing, and how do we maintain ourselves as part of this system. And you focus on, like, how do we ensure that the people we work with, the things that we're working for, can then carry that forward in a cyclical way, that we don't have to exist. A lot of the times charities are working, I can't remember who said this to me, if charities actually achieved what they're trying to achieve, they'd go out of business. Yeah. Right? So, and that's the care and the love element that's missing from so much of the work, because really you're working towards making sure you can still kind of exist. And what you should be working towards is ensuring that actually you are, in the end, what's the word I'm looking for? You're not needed anymore, because the goal has been accomplished, And I think that's the responsiveness, that's the flexibility and the movement. You have to move with the change that's happening rather than come back to the same problem repeatedly. That was a lot of words, but...
No, helpful words, because it just made me think about, as you were speaking there, I was just thinking about the different hats that you wear. So you as the lawyer, you as the Afro Palestinian woman, you as the person that works at Dara Youth Project, you as the person that is connected to different social movements, you as the creative. There are different hats, right? And I was thinking about this on two levels, but it's about the importance of everyone listening to each other. So, and I'm definitely projecting here because I also wear lots of different hats, and it's the different parts of me listening to each other. So the creative part influencing the role that you play within social movements, the social movements part influencing who you are or being influenced by who you are as an Afro-Palestinian woman, and that all of those different parts listening to each other so that you take up space in a way that allows you to center love of self and love as the people that you're working with. Then I think extending that outwards, I think there's something about how are we listening to each other, because people bring different things. And I think another challenge that I have in the sector, another challenge that feels really present for me at the moment, is just I'm in a lot of different spaces with different people that wouldn't be in the same space as each other. And it's like their judgment of each other doesn't allow that bridge for connection. And I think there's something about challenging oneself, challenging myself to extend love into spaces that typically I wouldn't. So that actually, what does that look like in the context of social justice? I mean, so like if we're all working towards, and we're saying we're all working towards the same thing, like what does it mean? What am I bringing to the table? Because I think it's easy to look at what an external party is doing that makes it difficult to love them or makes me want to cancel them or whatever it is. But it's more challenging to look at actually what am I bringing to that dynamic and what does that do for us moving forward. And that piece of like, what can you do today? I think even broadening that out to like, organizations, institutions, like, I get it. Like, I want a lot of these institutions abolished. I do, theoretically. But in practice, what can they do today? And where is the space? And again, I've got my red lines. So and that's a very individual thing. There are places that I won't step. So that actually, these are my boundaries. This is as far as I'm willing to go, which might be different to somebody else. But I think it's us really defining that, really being explorative and curious about what that is. I think there was a lot of my career where that wasn't defined by me. So it was like, I'm meant to be this type of person. So I'm meant to speak to those type of people and wear that type of clothes and drink from this water bottle. That it's got to the point of stupidity. That this is the prototype of who I'm meant to be. And if I'm not that person, if I'm not at that march, if I'm not in that conversation, if I'm not in that movement doing this role, then I'm not doing this right. And I think, thankfully, maturity and frustration and tiredness, and also seeing that actually there's flaws everywhere, has supported me to center love in truth. Like, and I actually just go where the vibe is. So I'm like, oh, I can vibe here. And sometimes I'm surprised by what that vibe is. So sometimes it might be with the person that works for the institution that is the devil, or that I was told I'm not meant to go near that person, or I'm not meant to go near that space. And actually the vibe don't lie. The vibe is like, no, they're cool. Like, you can be in conversation, and there is room to move beyond that. And I'm really trying to challenge and question myself in terms of like what those red lines are. But also having red lines is important. So it's not like, it's not me being like, do everything, go everywhere, but it is also knowing like the importance of defining that for yourself and being in a place of constant reflective practice, because that may shift and change.
Yeah. And I think also we're so socialized into, like, in England in particular, I moved here when I was 16, and I mean, I used to be so redliney. Like, if you worked in a bank, I was not going to have a conversation with you. If you were in the army at any point, I wouldn't have. And look, those are things that I still find difficult, you know. If you work in the stock market, I have questions. But now it's like, I have questions, you know, and I understand what it is to be working on a minimal salary, coming from a working class background, people I know who I grew up around, really struggling to raise their children, really struggling to survive, having no space for rest. And I understand wanting to live. I get it. I also understand generations of people who have come from really complex and difficult backgrounds who just want comfort. And that's actually totally fair and completely understandable. And I think we all have a responsibility in this time, and that's still something I'm going to challenge sometimes, and I'm going to have questions, but I will have the conversation. I had a friend who said to me when he was 16, he wanted to join the army, and I remember at the time biting his head off and being like, how could you, you know, because I'm Black Palestinian. I'm like, why would you want to join the British Army? Like, have you not seen all the destruction? And this was also a Black person, so I was like, I don't get it. And for him, growing up where he grew up, it was a genuine option to escape things that I could never have understood. And that was really one of the first conversations where I was like, okay, so I have personal red lines, and I'm not someone who believes the personal and the professional and the creative and don't blend. They absolutely do all of the time. And so, for example, this year, if someone hasn't got a clear stance on Palestine, I personally cannot. We're not going to be in a space where I'm going to challenge you and ask questions, because it's too much for me as a person. Equally, there are spaces where I'm privileged enough to be able to challenge and to be able to have healthy conversations. And I do think that's missing from the conversation around love and social justice, because love is not always easy. You're not, whether we're talking familial love, romantic love, friendship. I mean, the other thing that I think doesn't get enough emphasis when we talk about love is relationships that are like friendships, and how you challenge your friends and hold them accountable, and how that can be a loving act in and of itself, to say, actually, you've crossed a line for me, and I'm going to need you to recognize that, and I'm going to need us to have a conversation around it, or I might even need to step away, lovingly step away. Whether that's from a person, from a space, from an organization. I've had to at times recognize I'm not best placed to do this work. Someone else can do this way better than me. It's just making me uncomfortable, and then I can't thrive in this space, you know? And I think that's so important. And it's so difficult. Like you said, like as an abolitionist, I was watching docuseries about a serial killer last night, and I just found myself being like, he should just go to prison, actually. And I don't believe in prisons, and I don't believe in the criminal justice system. I don't think it's working. But also I'm a human with emotions and fears and anxieties, and that's the thing we have to create space for, is to recognise a lot of the time in the spaces where we're supposed to feel most comfortable, where everyone's politics aligns with ours, where everyone is super passionate about change, no one's really talking about how that change is going to happen. No one's really talking about the commonalities, and no one's talking about the fact that there will be problems. If we abolish prison, there will be problems that come from that. It's not an entirely safe process, but it's why I think the right is always the far right is always, they find their commonalities and then they step into that, and then there's internal problems. But I think I think the right is much more efficient at moving on from that, and focusing on bigger picture stuff. And I think what we need to move towards is understanding that, well, this isn't working, and we need to create alternatives. They're not going to be perfect, and we may disagree, and there are a lot of differences between us, but we have to create space for forgiveness and for kindness. And I'm not perfect. I've done a lot of things in my life, work-wise, personal-wise, where I've looked back on and gone, that wasn't the right way to go. And for me, it's really, creating the space to try and understand other people, because there are parts of the world where you travel to and no one's even talking about what your job is or what, And I think that's really important to bring into the space. We're lucky to live in London, I think, because you meet people from all walks of life, and that should be something we work with, rather than being in the spaces where everyone's an activist and everyone's a lefty and everyone's against this, that and the other. But we're not really talking about the core issues that actually make us very, very similar. And it's there that I found an ability to kind of be challenged and challenge in a way that brings us closer together.
I think there's something, as you're speaking there, a few things came up for me. I think there's something about, so back to the listening piece, how are we intentionally creating space to listen to one another, and really listen to hear and understand. How are we intentionally creating space for that? I think there's also a piece about being able to acknowledge when you are not resourced enough to listen, and that being okay as well. So that actually I'm not resourced, it's not that it's a bad or right or wrong thing, and so not making a moral judgment of it, but just recognizing, I don't have the resources to be in a listening space around this particular topic or with this particular person / institution. That being okay. I tend to be someone in most of the spaces that I'm in, I kind of exist on the margins of most of the spaces that I'm in. I'm someone that finds it easy to see different perspectives, even if I don't agree with them. So I'm able to be, I get why one could think that. Like, I don't think that, and like, I don't want people to think that, but I get how that thought could be created, right? And I think people might engage with that as me being contrary or whatever it is, and so I like also noticing that the part of my work and part of what I need to be responsible for is reading the room as to when and how to even bring that in. And I think there's so much in it. I think there's so much, and like bringing it back to the topic before we move into close, I think there's something about acknowledge what's coming up for me in this conversation is acknowledging the complexity of love, acknowledging the love is an ongoing, like there is an ongoing commitment that one must have to the practice of love in order to sustain this work in the context of social justice. It isn't like there are all these different parts and all these different moving pieces. The abolitionist thing that you just said really resonates with me, because again, I say this all the time kind of in my social circles, but it's like people are all abolitionists until that one case, that one thing that it's like, no, that's the thing that I can't budge on. And if I actually, can we be honest about that? And the complexity of that, and think to what would it look like to build something new? What would it really look like to build something new? What are the practicalities? Who do we need around the table? For me, it's everyone. It's actually everyone. And so even this idea of a world where, for me, ultimately, love and social justice work, there is like there isn't a world that exists, or in this country anyway, that exists with people that don't think differently to me. So that am I saying that, like, how do I account for that as I'm building these spaces of change? How do I account for the people that think vastly differently to me? And yeah, there's just so much. There's so much in that.
But I think that's the crux of it. It's so much easier to feel compassion. In fact, it's very easy to feel love and compassion for someone who thinks like you. And I think the real love comes from understanding and feeling compassion for people who don't think like you. And that spectrum extends, you know, when we talk about abolitionist politics, it's extending it to the people who really you just can't understand how they did a certain thing, how they moved in a certain way. But what you create a space where you assume that most people come at some point something went wrong, rather than this person is just this, that, or the other. And I think that for me is the role of kind of love in the social justice space, is about finding ways to care for, to love, to create space for the people who really are just on the complete other side of a spectrum to you. Because it's hard, it's really hard to maintain that. And it's really painful sometimes, you know. It's that space in a human, I think, maintaining that throughout adulthood, growing up in this world and getting to 30, 40, 50, 60. And this is why I always give so much love, grace and gratitude to my mother, because she is in her 70s and she just loves people and is such a loving person. And if I get to 70 and I have that much love in my heart, I will always count myself so lucky. And I think that's the crux of abolitionist work. That's the crux of making sure that we don't look at people and condemn them as evil, violent, awful, just in a very black and white space. And that's really painful and really hard, and it's not always going to be steady. There will be days, and, you know, this year, it's very much been a struggle for me to be able to feel compassion for all of humanity at this time. And I think that's really the most important part of the work and the hardest part of the work. And I think that's what we create space for. Yeah.
Thank you. You kind of answered it there, but I'll ask it again anyway, more explicitly for listeners. Just to round off, we're asking the question, what is the role of love in social justice work?
Yeah, I think reiterating what I've just said, it's creating compassion for the things that we don't love in ourselves first, I think, and then extending that out. And I think social justice work is about love. Justice is about love. It's about creating space for all of us to be able to exist safely. And I think it's really the core of it. It's the focus, and it should be the absolute centre of everything we do. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thanks, Sammarah. And
Thank you.
Thanks, people, for listening.
Thank you for listening to Surviving Society.
To support our work, you can rate,
review and subscribe. To host or produce a series of Surviving Society,
get in touch with us via Twitter or Instagram.